They are committed to personal and collective liberation and anchor their work in anti-oppression and trauma-informed principles. They are a big fan of drain and instant noodles. Nikki, I love drain as well, and instant noodles, so convenient. I was wondering if you could go ahead and start us off. Just share a little bit of the history of the Southeast Asian displacement and resettlement here in America.
Thank you so much, Mantha. Hi, everybody. It's good to see some familiar names. I temporarily sort of, I was dreaming about durian. And then I'm like, oh, I wish I was in Southeast Asia eating durian. I'm going to go straight into it because I prepared a long slide deck of history, and I'm going to honestly just like fly through it, and I fully apologize, and maybe if we have time afterwards we can go back and talk about some of it. So I'm going to share my screen. Please do not be frightened by the amount of text. I will not read it all. Actually, I should also say that I go by they and she, and I'm on Coast Salish territory right now. Can you all see my screen? I'm gonna take that as a yes until someone stops me. So yes, I just want to preface this history with saying that this is kind of the map of how Southeast Asia would look several hundred years ago, right? So like the nation state that we see today, it's a manifestation of something fairly recent. It's a result of colonization and imperialism. So a really brief timeline, and I will not read this all, but essentially the French had come, and like if you look at this map, you'll see this dark purple area down here. This would become Cochin China, which is a direct French colony. And then if you see the other lighter purple area, so French Indochina was essentially one colony, one direct colony called Cochin China, which would be this area down here. And then 4 protectorates, Annam, Tonkin, Kingdom of Cambodia, and Kingdom of Laos. And I'm going to show you that in the next map here. So I'm going to fast forward to 1940. So as French ruled all of Indochina, but as we know, World War II, France was occupied by Nazi Germany. And so between 41 and 45, Indochina was essentially a Japanese puppet state where Imperial Japan ruled Indochina in the same way that France ruled, Vichy France ruled itself. That is to say, it was under another rule. So just as in France, the Nazi oversaw how French was ruled in Indochina, Japan oversaw how Indochina would be ruled. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. So as World War II in Europe, and I say that in Europe because the war continued in Asia Pacific, as World War II came to a close in Europe, the French came back. So as you see this area down here, Cochin China, the French came back in September of 45 and said, give it back, it's ours. And that led to the first Indochina War. And then in 1954, as Viet Minh, which is a communist party led by Ho Chi Minh, defeated the French at a very decisive battle, it led to the Geneva Conference in July 1954, and essentially led to 3 successor states: Kingdom of Cambodia, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And so what was the Geneva Accords agreement? Vietnam would be split at the 17th parallel, which would only be temporary pending a nationwide election. And then no foreign troops can enter. At this time, so like if you can imagine a line here in this area at the midpoint roughly of Annam on this map, British troops would enter from the south to receive Japanese surrender troops, and Chinese troops would enter from the north to receive the Japanese surrendering troops. So after the Geneva Conference, we have in Vietnam Ngo Dinh Diem, who would depose the last emperor of Vietnam, Bao Dai, and then proclaim the formation of the Republic of Vietnam, which is more commonly known as South Vietnam. And Ngo Dinh Diem was essentially propped up by Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles. So the theme of this conversation is we are here because you were there. So this is the beginning of American meddling, as you can see. I mean, American meddling actually began before that, but I'm just gonna mention this right now. And I'm so sorry for this wall of text here, but basically they call it the Yim experiment, right? Essentially, it was just kind of like a way for them to see how they could control the area. And you can see here that France and United States both wanted a sort of a territory or a satellite state where they could exert their control over. So Ngo Dinh Diem refused to uphold the terms of the Geneva Accords for the nationwide election that I mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to pause for a moment to because we've talked through some intense stuff. So here are some cats for you, and I'm going to move on back to the war. Diem was deeply unpopular for a number of reasons that I posted here, and notably, Vietnam consisted of a high majority of peasants. And not only were the peasants under deep oppressive conditions, they did not own land, but the land that they were able to lease, they had to pay 25 to 50% of their rent back to the absentee landlords. And you can see here, a very small percentage of landowners held more than 80% of the cultivable rice land. So this led to revolts, and yet Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson continued to aid South Vietnam to put down the the revolts. So you can see here, split at the 17th parallel, we had the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the state of South Vietnam here, and Laos and Cambodia. So this had been after the Geneva Conference when these states had been created. So in '64, the US fabricated an event to essentially give itself the reason to go to war. And it's sort of like a legal justification to enter Vietnam with armed troops. Seeing that, as I mentioned, the South Vietnamese government was unpopular and the army was not having all of the support of the people, Lyndon Johnson started a bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder. And here's a map of all of the places where Vietnam and Laos had been bombed. So you can see here from Legacy of War, the bombing in Laos was every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. So continue on to the second, in the timeline of the Second Indochina War, Nixon sabotaged a peace talk so that he can win an election in '68. As the war became really unpopular, Nixon said, you know what, we're gonna have peace with honor, and began to give South Vietnam as much weapon as he could. And what ended up happening is South Vietnam ended up with the world's 4th largest air force. So at the end of the war in '73, the Paris Peace Accords was signed. And at the end of that year, 95% of troops had left Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. From '75 to '79, there was a massive purge of people that Pol Pot considered and I'm gonna have Sheila talk about this more, but the Cambodian genocide, which today is the Day of Remembrance, triggered an outflow of refugees. As the US and its allies pulled out of Vietnam, they put sanctions, trade embargoes on Vietnam for 2 decades, and leaving massive poverty, environmental damage with 10 years of Agent Orange dumping, making the soil untillable. Some more cats for you. So I'm just gonna say, so this is a little more personal, my personal story coming to the US because I am here, because they were there. I apologize for the massive wall of text here, but this is from an article I wrote. I'd be happy to send it to you. But basically, what I want you to know is there were 3 waves in the exodus because of the reasons that I mentioned: war, economic sanctions. So after 75, there was the first wave of people who had been allies of the US. And the second wave would have been in the late 70s and early 80s, people who fled by sea and by land. And then in the third wave, there was what was called the orderly departure program. And that's the program that that my family came to the US under. There's also a fourth wave, which I did not mention here, consisting of people who come after what's considered the normalization of diplomatic relations between the US and Vietnam. I'm going to breathe. And basically international students, people who came under the family reunion programs. So that's a very, very, very brief history from French colonization until late 70s and into the early 90s of how Viet people end up in the US. I'm going to pass it over to Sheila to talk more about her family history.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikki. Yeah, firstly, just thank you for preparing all of that. I feel so lucky to like be schooled by you right now on that. I also kind of just before I start, also want to just express gratitude and appreciation for being in this space. Like I think in my introduction was said, I'm a baby academic. I'm finishing up my first year in a PhD program, and I've been straddling like organizing and now like academic spaces. So I'm really appreciative to kind of share. Like my mind is a mess a little bit, navigating this academic space and thinking about these issues of displacement and resettlement from that perspective, and that it's so personal to me. And so, yeah, my mind is kind of all over the place, and I really appreciate being able to like bring up some of the questions that I'm wrestling with too, in that space as I'm thinking about what really displacement and resettlement means and what we can learn about the meaning of that from Cambodian refugees and from also the second generation experience too. So thank you, Nikki, for passing it over to me to talk about my family history. There are really so many facets to my family's refugee story, some of which has a second generation refugee, meaning that I was born in the States after the war. I'm still learning so many of those facets, right? I'm learning those in the intimate moments with my mom, cooking with my mom and my aunts. I'm learning that at family gatherings really slowly. And now, as I'm speaking about it too, I really recognize that this is something that I personally have been missing in quarantine, but also like losing or not having access to those types of moments point to really the psychological effects and the spiritual loss that we can't quantify, that are stolen away from our community, from the impacts of imperialism that Nikki talked about, that continue to live on, right? As we live in diaspora, those moments are stolen even before we can have them, and also that it brings me to bring up too that our community continues to face other forms of separation, or even like cyclical separation through deportation and gentrification. And so that the loss of those moments kind of cycle through that way too. Now that I've spoken about kind of how I've come to know my family's refugee story and some of the limitations around that, I'm going to share one part of my family's refugee story, which I think helped to really illustrate themes of not just separation, but also reunion. So my family was separated by the war. And at the time of the Khmer Rouge takeover, one side of my mom's family, her cousins who she lived with up until 1970, 5 years before the Khmer Rouge takeover, they all lived in the countryside together. But because of a number of factors at the time of the takeover, my mom and her family had moved to the capital, and so they were swept up and experienced the work camps and the refugee camps. But her family that lived in the countryside, for a number of reasons, they were able to flee to France, and so they were first wave refugees who didn't experience the work camps and the refugee camps, and they were separated kind of from that point on. I want to really briefly zoom out from my family story to speak broadly about how Cambodian refugees experienced resettlement. The US brought our community here through the refugee resettlement program, but it failed to live up to this image of refuge, right? That is assumed to provide stability. We were brought to the US as part of the largest refugee resettlement program in US history, which included over 1.4 million refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The US really positioned itself as a savior of refugees who were to be rescued from a conflict that, as was pointed out, the US started or instigated, and promised to resettle folks and stabilize folks, but really abandoned our communities in a lot of ways. We were subjected to the same systematic marginalization as many other communities of color in the US. And this is often referred to as the school to prison pipeline, but because of the context for Southeast Asian refugees, what we can add to that is that this is the school to prison to deportation pipeline in our case. And we were resettled in impoverished neighborhoods with failing schools, racial profiling, over-policing, and mass incarceration that has too often led to harms in communities of color. And so kind of zooming back into my story, my family was separated since before the war, having that experience too of resettlement in the US. But 3 years ago, my family that was resettled, my family was reunited with the family that we were separated from, who ended up in France. My aunt and my cousins came to the US for my wedding 3 years ago. And my cousin, whom I met for the first time, performed the blessing dance at my wedding. And it was really in that moment, to watch her perform an art that was nearly lost to genocide, and to reunite after war, trauma, and resettlement. It made me think of what it means to be together despite imperialism, borders, distance, and time. Like, that moment should be impossible, right? So I really share this story to highlight that we live the impossible every day. That under imperialism, our joy should be impossible. So like, that really points to what folks say about like our joy being resistance, right? And secondly, this togetherness, what I have at other points called a reunion, should be impossible, and that's also powerful. So folks who are organizing around deportation are really harnessing the power of togetherness to keep our families, to keep our folks home, and to keep our families together. And so this is what we mean by our joy being resistance. It literally is. Reunion is both a method of organizing and our goal. It's how we live our lives.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sheila, for sharing that and talking about just your Cambodian refugee experience. And Nikki, I just want to also acknowledge all the things that you shared. I'm like, man, you were just schooling us. And really, those are the things that need to be taught in our schools now. Like, I wish that my kids could have learned the things that you shared, because that's important to us as a Southeast Asian. But yeah, so I just wanted to acknowledge that too. Sheila, I know you talked a little bit already about like your family reunification. Can you say a little bit more though about the significance of you growing up in Long Beach, where most of us know it as Cambodian town?
Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry, just a sec. Yeah, sorry, Monta, I can share about that. Long Beach is really significant to me. I didn't say this earlier, but I'm on Tonva land in what is known now as LA. So I'm not in Long Beach right now. I recently moved, but Long Beach is really significant to me. I grew up there, as it's significant to me as well as to like folks in the Cambodian diaspora, because it has the largest population of Cambodians outside of Cambodia, and because of the togetherness that I was describing earlier, it's almost indescribable to talk about what it means to grow up there. But to talk about what it means to grow up in community, the fact that I had other Cambodian families kind of growing up alongside me who understood the war, who understood PTSD without me having to explain that, like that is a big part of like my healing and my family's healing. the fact that my folks always had access to like the appropriate resources too that they needed, that's really significant. But to help us think more about what it means to form community in diaspora, I want to hold in tension, what I was describing about how special it is to be in Long Beach and to be in community. I want to hold that in tension with some of the challenges too that I've observed, right, in Cambodia town. So during the organizing that the Southeast Asian Freedom Network did this past summer around the uprisings, we noticed that a lot of folks in our community were really down with like the calls around Black Lives Matter and defunding the police, but really drew this line at protecting businesses, right? And so kind of when I reflect back on like why that was, they're really defining community as a specific place, and that place was defined by businesses and business interest. So like, in preparing for this, Nikki and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday, but we see all these moves by like city governments and like business councils, business associations to designate these business districts like Cambodia Town or Little Saigon. And while that makes, I want to acknowledge like that it's important for us, kind of some of the reasons that I was starting to say earlier, and that while it allows, like it makes people feel seen, while it's important to have a place to gather, but it brings up like these really critical questions that I really want our community to wrestle with. Firstly, when we define our community by businesses, and when we can overlook or divorce that from the actual people in our community, right? And especially the most marginalized, folks who are impacted by the failing schools, racial profiling, over-policing, mass incarceration, that really define our resettlement. When we do that, we're really missing the point. We have to think of our community as a whole, and that means centering the folks who are the most marginalized. When we center the most marginalized folks, we know that we won't be free until Black folks are free. And so defunding the police has to be central to our analysis of what it means to keep families together. What I'm sharing about like hitting this wall of ethnic businesses in like anti-racist organizing during the uprising, pro-Black organizing during the uprising, it illustrates why it's problematic to rely on a singular place, right, as our community, because our community is actually people, right? And so I think this example kind of helps to kind of illustrate what some of the hard questions that we come up against when those things come in tension. We always have to center, and what I want to uplift is that we always have to center our people, right? The most marginalized to be together. The other thing that I think that this brings up that we really need to wrestle with is, and that we need to take seriously, is the question of what it means to claim land on occupied territory. As the title of our talk says, we are here because you were there. So within the context of settler colonialism, which refers to how the US as a project was colonized by a people who permanently settled and took over the land. Like as the title of this talk kind of alludes to, as refugees, we were also subjects to other forms of colonialism and imperialism. So while we're not settlers, we also have to recognize we're not indigenous folks to this land either, right? But we are here. We're arrivants in some ways, and so we have to, as arrivants, we have to really contend with the implications of what it means to have refuge, right? To be here. And that's really messy. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. I'm just bringing this up to say that one of the dangers of tying like our community to like a settled notion of place, it really brings up this hard question of what it means to claim land that is occupied. And kind of just lastly, I want to also, like, as I'm acknowledging settler colonialism, I want to acknowledge our responsibility as refugees and as arrivants to the U.S. to really call out the enablement of settler colonialism in other places, including in occupied Palestine, and to really, in wrestling with these hard questions that I'm bringing up, really urge folks to learn more about what is going on in Palestine and to be in solidarity with the people of Palestine too.
Thank you. Yes, definitely need to be in solidarity. And I know that Nikki's going to talk about that in a little bit. I just wanted to add, being a Southeast Asian here in the state of Minnesota, especially after the aftermath of George Floyd, it was really hectic. And I think, I think one of the important things to really mention is, Sheila, you talked about, CFIN holding that space last year, right? And I was really honored to be a part of that panel where we have to do a lot of political education around anti-Blackness. And I think the cool thing about that was we saw like the Hmong folks doing it, where there was a conversation with the Hmong community, and you had, you know, 4 leaders who were talking about what it means to be pro-Asian and then also be pro-Black. And so we did a lot of those education pieces around that over the course of the last year, and we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And so it was really difficult. We also had a conversation, I know, in the Vietnamese community around what it meant to also be in solidarity with Black folks. And then when the Khmer folks did that, it opened up a lot of opportunities for us to really provide that political education, because our communities need it, and it starts with us showing them what it means. And I want to really just add quick too about colorism, about how that is so real within all of our communities, and that we really need to educate our loved ones what it means, just because community is everyone, and in order for us to do this work, we have to first love our community, right, and be in solidarity. So with that, I just want to turn it over to you, Nikki. If you can add, you know, to a little bit more about the anti-Asian racism and how people are viewing that right now, and then talking a little bit more about our Black brothers and sisters. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Martha. I was telling everyone before, as we were getting prepped for this conversation, that I have a lot of fire in me today, right now, because today Biden signed that crime bill, the anti-Asian hate crimes bill, and it's so infuriating for me to see a lot of the Asian Americans, the elite Asian Americans, the legislators, the represent Asians, who are applauding this move as a progressive move, right? And but before I get into my Asian hate for the anti-Asian hate crimes bill, I just want to go back to something that you mentioned really quick, Mantha, because you mentioned, you know, our history, and because the focus of this talk is we are here because you were there, right? And how we don't know our history, and because we don't know our history, sometimes we are not always super clear on sort of our role and kind of what Sheila was talking about as people on this land. And even just the way that we call ourselves as Southeast Asian, right? Like Southeast Asia is massive, and yet there is a very specific geographical designation that is considered Southeast Asia, and that's because during World War II, the US and the UK decided to sort of name these areas, right? And so they had the Asia Pacific War, and it was called the theater, and they had the Pacific Ocean Theater, the Southwest Pacific Theater, and then they had the Southeast Asian Theater, right? And then we were in the Southeast Asian Theater, and that's kind of like how we became Southeast Asian in a way. And so like, there's so many of these things that we have to just keep digging, because like the effect and the impact of these geopolitical imperialist wars keep reverberating in so many tiny aspects of our lives. But back to anti-Asian, and I so deeply hate the word anti-Asian hate, and it's not because I like drank a large, you know, tall glass of haterade or something like that, but the word hate is again, it frames the problem as an individual problem, right? It's the effect of liberalism in the US. And so we now are sort of conditioned or socialized to imagine violence as something that is an individual thing that can be addressed with more love, more unconscious bias training, and more empathy, more mindfulness training, more 10-day meditation, loving kindness trainings, right? And then if you are still hateful afterwards, then you're somehow defective, and that's like another ableist thing. And then you just have to be removed from society, or you just have to be locked up. And I'm not saying that we don't need more empathy and love. Like, I can always use more love and empathy, but we have to keep focusing on addressing and analyzing the systems, because the systems create the conditions for violence to arise. The anti-Asian hate doesn't address the fact that, like, what is Orientalism? Sheila, you're talking about we have to be in solidarity with Occupy Palestine. Well, Edward Said, who is Palestinian, wrote a whole book about Orientalism, right? Why is it that a lot of people who've been attacked and assaulted and murdered have certain sort of appearance or outward appearances, and it's because they're perceived or they look Chinese, and so we have to address xenophobia. Just like after 9/11, there was this massive spike in assaults and murders of people who are perceived as Muslim, whether they are or not, right? So we need to like name these things, because if we don't name them, then we're just like nebulous anti-Asian, and Asia is like this massive, massive continent. And so yeah, we just need to continue to just like poke at the system rather than just like say hate. And then if we just say like, well, you gotta stop hating, that's the solution, then we'll never actually get to the roots of it, and we'll never get to the roots of settler colonialism and militarism, as we know, affects all of our lives. And what's violent? Poverty is really violent. Like, it's so deeply violent, and US imperialism creates so much poverty all around the world. And the military continues to profit from them too in the US, right? Because the military recruits people in areas that have been deeply neglected. So if we don't name all of these things and we just kind of go around and say stop AAPI hate, it has no weight. It's so teethless. And how do we begin to address the problems if we're just kind of going around with like a fluff and weightless slogan? Asian American as a political identity came out of the 60s, and they were explicitly anti-imperialism. They were explicitly anti-racist, right? And what are we doing now? Like, what is our movement? So yeah, we just have to keep stressing the roots of suffering, which is like structural. Like gendered colonial violence, that's structural. Labor exploitation is structural. Disposability under capitalism is structural. And another thing is, as we sort of get folded into imperialist DE&I, a lot of the things that we think would protect us actually end up not protecting us and end up being quite anti-Black, because anytime that we expand the carceral state, anytime that we give more power to the police, the prosecutors, the prisons, these are essentially really anti-Black policies. So anytime that we say, yay, hate crime bills, well, the language of hate crime bill actually makes it so that they can create, like hate crime legislation just means that it's at the disposal, or it's at the hands of the prosecutors to consider what is a hate crime and what is not a hate crime. And that always ends up actually working against Black and Indigenous people. So I would just really encourage everybody, thank you for listening to my tirade. Please stop saying Asian hate. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Wow. No, thank you. I think a lot of us were educated even on you sharing that, because I think when people think about anti-Asian hate and they think about a bill or legislation that could pass, if folks aren't educated by an expert like you, they would all just think that is going to be something that will protect our people, right? Because we all look the same. We fall under the umbrella of an AAPI, et cetera. But I mean, you even just saying, so it's not just anti-Asian hate if we don't name and destroy the systems, like that enough. And so I'm gonna just share exactly what everything was supposed to have been said. I feel like, and so Nikki says, so it's not just anti-Asian hate. If we don't name and destroy the systems that create the conditions that produce violence, we will just keep writing statements. We will just keep holding vigils, and the systems will keep killing us. And mostly it is our Black brothers and sisters. At the rate that the police are killing anybody else, is not the same as the rate that our Black brothers and sisters are being murdered at the hands of the police. And so I appreciate like anti-Asian, like people talking about anti-Asian hate or defunding the police, but it has to be so much more. We have to dismantle those systems that continue to oppress us. So thank you for sharing all of that, Nikki, and continue to tirade, girl, because that was the shit. But yes, and so with that being said, I want to turn it back over to you though, to talk about the most recent, as people with this type of history, and Sheila alluded to it earlier too, is we also have to be in constant solidarity with the Black folks, right? With all of our people, and then also with people all over the world, especially right now, in Palestine. And so can you share a little bit more about what solidarity means?
For me or Sheila? For me?
For you, yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for reading some of the stuff that I wrote too. Like for transparency for folks who are watching, like I wrote all the stuff and I shared with the Minnesota 8 team, and then I kind of go off script. But yeah, your question was how do we, what do we do now to be in solidarity with people in Palestine? And I think the first thing is always education. Dr. Mbedka said to educate, agitate, and organize, right? So the 3 prongs. And so education, I think political education especially is extremely important. Even sometimes when we're like really well-meaning and really well-intentioned, if we don't know history, sometimes we could unintentionally do things that may not be so useful. But before I talk about Palestine specifically, I want to talk about imperialism, right? Because again, reiterating the theme of like why there are refugees in the first place, and why are we here? And imperialism is like this word that gets thrown around. Like I think more and more people are talking about it, but I'm not sure that everyone is like always fully we don't always have the same, like if I say car, you probably think of like a car that you owned or like a car that you want to own or something. And then I might think about a different car. So, we say the word car, but we have different ideas of what it is. So I just want to kind of set the foundation for what imperialism means. And imperialism, especially in a classical definition, is that it's a trans-border, culturally legitimized center meaning like we're in the center right now, we're in the US, center, and periphery. Periphery is outside, so like outside of the US border. So it's a center periphery structure of unequal exchange, and it is the sum of 4 interlocking functions of power. And like these 4 functions of power have to work together, and they have to operate at the same time together. And that is political power, military power, economic power, and cultural power. So what I mean by political power is, so the US has control of the UN. So the US last week was able to veto 2 times. I think there was a 3rd time, but I'm definitely sure there were 2 times that the US definitely vetoed the fact that the UN wanted to put out a statement about Israel and Palestine. And the UN wanted to say that this, just like a really mild statement saying to condemn the violence at holy sites, right, at the mosque. So like not even anything radical. Like the UN is just kind of like can we just put out like the most vanilla statement possible? And the US voted to block it, right? And they did that twice. So that's the political control. Military power, the US has 800 plus military bases around the world and has full control of NATO. Economic power, the US has the most vote power at the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF. So that's economic power. And cultural power, so the US also controls quite a few kind of these institutions that claim to be the de facto keepers of culture, like UNESCO. So four powers: political, military, economic, and cultural. And imperialism creates displacement because it creates the conditions for people to have to leave, to have to migrate, to have to be in diaspora via war, via sanctions, and sanctions will create poverty and medical apartheid. Like, I grew up in Vietnam after the war, and so if you grew up drinking milk, I grew up drinking. So when my mom cooks rice, you know how the rice water is a little milky? I would drink that and with a little bit of sugar. So it's like sugar milk water. I mentioned war, sanctions, and then economic liberalism. So imperialism creates via like free markets, free trade, globalization, privatization, etc. It creates really untenable living conditions for people in the global south, and they have to leave, they have to migrate, or they have to figure out other ways to make a living. So as we saw, the massacre in Atlanta, a lot of the women working in massage parlors are displaced as a result of kind of economic liberalism. And then another thing is imperialism encourages and sets the terms of belonging, right? So like this idea of being American. So imperialism sets the term for belonging because Americanness is set and is defined by the US, by a white supremacist institution. And so if you are considered a skilled worker, then you get folded into the model minority if you're Asian, and then it criminalizes and it devalues the labor of people that it would consider low wage workers, and it would consider them and it would make them disposable. And then a lot of these people also end up in the in prisons, and then end up in the deportation pipeline, so-called pipeline. So back to Palestine. So what has happened in Palestine is settler colonialism and displacement. And to begin, I mentioned I would encourage everyone to do their political education. And also I would encourage everyone to look into the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanctions. It's the Palestinian-led effort to essentially end international support for Israel's oppression. And then like is to put pressure on Israel to comply with international policies and laws. And so the three demands of the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement are: number one is to end occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantle the wall. I was able to go to Israel and Palestine a couple of years ago, and was able to see the wall. It's so deeply inhumane. And I do not wish for anyone to have to live in the conditions that the wall creates, and Israel settler colonialism as well. So that's the number one demand. The second demand is to recognize the fundamental rights of Palestinians and Arab citizens for full equality. So right now what's happening in Palestine is Israeli citizens have a lot of rights that Arab Palestinian citizens do not. Not even access to very basic thing like the water grid, like the electricity grid, like access to sewage system. And the third demand is respect, protect, and promote the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and their properties as stipulated in the UN Resolution 194. So right now, I have seen two figures. I don't know which figure is the correct one, so I'll just mention two. There's either 6 or 7 million Palestinians in diaspora as a result of the creation of the State of Israel and Nakba in 1948. I was able to visit a Palestinian refugee camp where getting a little emotional, where the elders still have the keys to their house where they were forced to leave because they still have dreams of returning to their homes. So the BDS movement, the third point, demands the rights for them to return to their homes. So please, look up the BDS movement. And then finally, supporting the one-state solution for Palestine. So that's what I have for that, for your question.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I think that even for me, as a believer, I think it's, or as a Christian, I think that it's often hard being a woman of color in this type of movement around social justice, and then also being a Christian. And when I think about what's happening in Palestine right now, I hear your heart behind it, and having had the opportunity to go to Palestine, and I hear about what's going on over there and the fires and stuff that are happening. I mean, there's simply like another war that is happening right before our eyes. And I think, like you mentioned, it is definitely more than love. There has to be something that we can do as people to be able to love others and to really just show up for the community. And so I want to just turn it over and just remind folks who are watching that we will turn it over right now for some Q&A for the last part of our talk series for the night. And again, just reminding folks that if you do want any of the information that was prepared that we shared earlier today, we would be happy to send that over to you. Please just let us know. And then if you guys have any questions right now, please feel free to send them our way. But I do have just a couple questions that I will turn over to our panelists right now for some further discussion. Sheila, I know you mentioned earlier that you're a baby academic right now, like going to school for your PhD, and congratulations to doing that, because there are so many of our community members who don't have that opportunity. And so I just want to ask you, like, when you hear about the history that Nikki has shared and the knowledge that's being informed right now, how does that impact your work as an organizer?
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate the congratulations. I guess, like, I don't know what brought me into academia. Like, I really recognize that, like, to be in this position is not of my own doing completely. It's not just like, oh, I achieved this. This is something that, like, I like, it's not all my own doing. This is like, oh, it was the whole community that got me here. And this wasn't necessarily where I wanted to be either. I don't know if I should be saying that, like, out loud, but like I didn't want to go into academia. I was like really set on like working or contributing to movement building in like the ways that were available, which is mostly through like nonprofit organizations. And I felt that, like, not to that there are definitely limits. Like, I think, as so many of us know, right, in organizing from like the perspective of like of nonprofits, because of the nonprofit industrial complex. And so I just decided that that wasn't for me, but I wanted to continue to do this work and to continue contributing to movement building. And I was like, well, I want to do so and really have freedom of thought. And it just came up that, like, maybe I should try being an academic and I should consider this. And so that's kind of how I've come into academia this past year, was just me trying on that hat, to be honest with you. I still don't know if it's quite for me. I'm figuring that out, to be quite honest. But I think I kind of just share my story to point out that, like, yeah, academia is not like the answer, to, or should not be privileged as like being something really special to movement building. It is, but it's just one part of the web. Does that make sense? Oh, and I guess the question was about like my work too. I'm really driven to like use academia as a vehicle to do like I said earlier, work around movement building, to tell the stories of that I've seen from organizing, because organizers are always theorizing, right? Organizers and folks who are directly impacted are always trying to make sense of the world, because we have to. We can't. We don't have an option to just accept things and accept them blindly. As we experience injustices like it directly, and we see it right before our eyes, we're always trying to understand, well, how is it that this happened? So we're always doing theorizing. I'm trying to like use academic tools in order to kind of articulate and think more about kind of the theories that I think that we're coming up with kind of on the ground.
Great, thank you. Nikki, I want to turn it over to you. I mean, you were the one that provided us and did the schooling, right, on us. But I want to just say, like, you know, for you as an organizer, I can hear your passion and your drive, and just everything that you have shared is because of how the systems have made you feel. So how is it, like, the things that you've learned, because you obviously got that from somewhere, which I believe that all of us had the opportunity to go in and do the research ourselves to get this information, but you were able to provide that to us. How has that impacted your work as an organizer? Because organizing is so different, like the ways in which people organize.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Martha. Before I go into that question, I just want to append a tiny bit to what I mentioned earlier about Palestine. So Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism, said that Palestine is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. There's as little historical justification for homogeneity as there is for notions of national or ethnic or religious purity today. And when I was in Palestine, I spoke to a Palestinian organizer, and I asked them about the like, what does it mean, a one-state solution? What does it mean, the two-state solution? And he said, well, you live in the United States. Do you have all Buddhists living in one state, and then all Muslims living in another state, and then all Christians living in another state? And I'm like, no. And he's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And so he said, we are capable of living together in a multi-religious, multicultural society. So I just want to add that in there. So your question, Mantha, was about how learning about history informed my work as an organizer. And I would say that it has been life-changing, to be honest, because when I began organizing, I was a baby organizer out of school, at the height of the Iraq War, doing protests. And then, you know, I don't know if you remember, in the 2000s, we talked a lot about global warming. Of course, we talk about climate justice today, right? So the language has changed. I think because people are like, global sounds good, and then global warming also sounds good. So global warming doesn't sound so bad, right? So I think maybe that's maybe a marketing decision. I don't know. In any case, global warming was a major concern and still is. And but in the early 2000s, that was the language. And then I got really involved in transit justice and environmental justice, right? Because I really was passionate about transit as a way for people to get around, especially around disability, around how people don't need to have the wealth to buy a car in order to be able to be mobile, right? I love your cat so much, Sheila. Thank you so much for sharing your cat on screen with us. But when I was organizing during that time, I had no theory. I didn't have a framework to operate against. It was pure liberalism. It was pure individualism. And it was just like, why don't people like to take the bus? I don't get it. We have to go and convince more people to take the bus. Or I don't understand why people would just recycle. You know, why don't people do things that will be environmentally friendly? So it was just like this idea that people just need to be convinced of the sort of, in a way, it's like a moral standpoint, right? Like a moral justification for why you do something. And I think operating from a moral justification for a framework for organizing did not work for me. And it was exhausting because a lot of it was always about moral outrage. And a lot of it was also about how angry I was. And I think anger is a really useful thing. It's very useful fuel. So I don't think of things in terms of bad or good, but I think of whether it's useful or not. And for organizers, as we witness a lot of injustice happening around us, like necessarily we feel anger, we feel compassion, but a lot of times it can also come like fast and furious, like if I can go whoosh, and then it can also like come crashing down really fast. And so and it's also not sustainable. So what has been really helpful for me is not only just knowing what I want to dismantle, but knowing what I want to build towards. So it's not just about sort of like dismantle white supremacy, but then what comes after, dismantle patriarchy, but what comes after. And so that has led me to reading a lot about history, reading a lot about theory, understand why people came to the conclusion that they did. And as I'm radicalized by a lot of Black organizers, the Black radical tradition in the United States is really rich and strong. And a lot of these organizers came to the conclusion that is socialism or barbarism, you know? Like if we're anti-capitalist, then what's next, right? We have to be able, and like Sheila said, like I'm so grateful for academics who can study movements, who can study contradictions, who can study history, and then give us some tools, give us a map for where we're going. Because otherwise, I think what I'm observing, especially with all of the anti-Asian violence, sort of like the search in interest in organizing, is a lot of people are coming in with a lot of energy, but not a lot of foundation, not a lot of understanding of like all the things like history of theory. And so the challenge is how to harness that energy, but also how to set a foundation, because otherwise people burn out really fast. And then organizers who don't have a foundation also act in a way that can sometimes create more harm, even though they mean really well. So it's been a tremendous thing for me to be able to ground myself in history and theory.
Yeah, thank you for stating that. That is actually really true. When you talk about a lot of folks coming into it with energy and then could actually end up causing more harm when they don't come from a place where there's foundation. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question for you, Nikki. It kind of ties into what you just said. So you've navigated finding a lot of this knowledge, right? When a lot of the knowledge out there is US propaganda, how are you navigating that? How are you navigating finding the knowledge when there's a lot of knowledge out there, that a lot of the knowledge out there is US propaganda, or we would like to call it like bobalibs.
Sorry, was it for me or Sheila?
No, it's for you. It was specifically for Nikki.
Oh, how do I navigate US propaganda?
No. How have you navigated finding knowledge, like all the knowledge that you've just spit and shared to us, when a lot of the knowledge that is out there is US propaganda? Shared some real stuff, girls. So that's what I think that's what folks are recognizing. So yes, that's the question.
Yes. That this is true. Let me think about this. This is a really good question. And I think it's a process. I don't think it's like a prescription. So I think everybody will have their own way. But I would always say the main thing that I can share in my experience is in critical race in critical gender studies, in a lot of the studies, there is a so for example, in critical gender studies, we talk about how homosexuality is created because heterosexuality needs to be defined, right? Or like what is defined, what is considered feminine or female, like male needs female to exist in order to define itself. So whiteness, for example, in critical race theory said, we don't know what whiteness is, but we're gonna say what it is not. And whiteness studies and whiteness scholars have pointed to how as European colonizers were going around the world and observing how other people live, would say, well, that's not us. Like if the people are dressed in colorful clothes, if the people are celebrating their festivities with dances and music, that's not us, right? So we don't do that, right? So there is like this defining of what whiteness is and defining of what, for example, the US is by saying what it is not. And the US has taken, has like the conditioning that I realized that I was given in the US is that there is a default and the US is the default, and then everybody else is not that. So American food is American food, but everybody else is ethnic, right? The church is an American or a white church, but then there's a Black church or there's a Korean church, right? So like the US has taken this and sort of like the same way that a cis straight man is considered the default human and everybody else is sort of some perverse deviation from it, the US has also taken that position. So I would say that that is something that I have recognized, and it's kind of a framework that I use, is like, how does the US consider itself to be the pinnacle of democracy, the beacon of democracy? When it went and intervened an election in Vietnam, and everybody's like, well, that's normal. You know, how does the US say, I'm going to go and spread democracy around the world? And everyone's like, of course, US democracy needs to be spread around and no one questions it, right? And especially because this specific conversation that we're talking about right now is about why are we in the US? You know, we are here because you were there, right? So all we need to do is look back in history. And if we look at history, especially after World War II and US policies of containment, we realize that the US was trying to sort of assert its hegemony, right? It was coming up with a foreign policy, right? And I say foreign because to us, like what's foreign or what's domestic, because it all affects us. So as the US was creating this geopolitical strategy called containment, it really wanted to make sure that communism did not spread to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America. And why is that? It's because this specific period was a period of decolonizing. It was a period of especially Asia and Africa rising and telling Western European powers that they would no longer be under European shackles. And so as a lot of countries were decolonizing and were coming out of this period that would be under Western influence or Western power, the US also wanted to replace that power. And so just like looking into how the US moved and created a lot of these policies, and then recognizing that the media is essentially a fourth branch of the government for the US, recognizing that Hollywood is also another branch of government because Hollywood received a lot of money from the military, especially during World War II, to spread propaganda. So like the more that I keep looking into this, the more that I realize everybody has a specific position and everybody has a bias, and necessarily so does the US. And so the US just cannot consider itself to be a neutral or standard or default. It has a position. And so then the next question is, what is that position? And then we just have to keep follow. And then we just have to keep follow as we are anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist movement people. what is the motivation behind a lot of the policies that the US sets? Is it about land? Is it about labor? It's always about land and it's always about labor.
Thank you, Nikki. I too want to try to address this question of like, how do we filter through kind of what we're taught, right? And I think I really want to kind of question like, what is knowledge, and to encourage us to to be empowered and like understand that we're knowledge, like, right, our experiences are knowledge, like and like I think I spoke earlier about like learning about my family's history through stories. That's knowledge, right? And like going through life as we're like being taught propaganda at times where we don't, like, where it's everywhere in the way that like Nikki was talking about, that it's important to always like to trust our bodies, trust like how things sit with us. You know, if we're being told that the reason why our folks are incarcerated and deported is because they deserve to be so, and we know that that's not true. No, it's not true. You know, and that is why, and so trust those truths, and to like continue to be critical with things that don't sit with our experiences, because we're not crazy, we're not lying, like, right? So yeah, just always being critical, and that is true kind of in because knowledge is all around us and we're always like being inundated, right, with like information, and but like, so in the everyday sense, but that's also something that like I contend with a lot in academia as well, right? Like when I'm trying to talk about refugee stories and why, like, and look at the refugee as a site of critique of imperialism, of liberalism, when folks like question, how do I know what I know? There's no other, like, whom, you know, what are the studies that say this or that? I know it because I lived it. I'm around folks who lived those things, right? So it's not just about like I guess qualifying like what we know against kind of what is accepted, right? It's also recognizing that we are producers of knowledge, that we contain knowledge already.
Thank you. Thank you guys both for answering that. Yeah, it was a hard question, but I definitely wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because all the crap that we're hearing is US propaganda. But anyways, I have another question for you. So for either one of you, whoever wants to speak to it, but I know you both have talked a lot about US imperialism. So what is the role of Southeast Asians in the US to dismantle US imperialism? And then another thing too, another question I would want to that we also got is, what is like a position for us as refugees? I know Nikki, you shared it earlier, you know, about stolen land. So two-part, dismantling us as Southeast Asians, dismantling U.S. imperialism, and then how do we position ourselves as refugees on stolen land? And any one of you guys, that one wasn't addressed to anybody.
I think I want to like reiterate kind of the two examples that we talked about earlier, in terms of like if we're brought into this movement of around like into movement building because of our experience and our families' experiences as refugees, then Palestine is really the litmus test. We are seeing refugees being created. And so if we are so like moved by our own experiences, then why does that not apply when there are refugees from other countries that are being created, right? If we know that that the effects of imperialism last for so long and have impacted our lives so much, then that is exactly what should be moving us to be involved in and to like take a stand in other issues. And right now that's Palestine. You know, as we spoke a little bit about like our own, like my own family history, and Nikki about hers, like the refugee camps for our families were like a number of years, right? Like I'm not sure how long my family was in the refugee camps, but like that short compared to Palestinians have been fighting for their land for generations. Like you have folks who have been in refugee camps for generations, right? And so it's a different context, and it's again, refugees created through settler colonialism, whereas Southeast Asian refugees were created through imperialism. But it's so many of the same logics. So if we're about being refugees, then we need to stand with all refugees. So yeah, I think Palestine is really the litmus test around that. And then in terms of like questioning what it means to be refugees on stolen land, I think that, again, I don't have answers around that, but that is, I think having that question, being critical of that is like a starting point for why we need to be truly in solidarity, right? It's about building community and building those relationships with folks, and like educating ourselves around that too. Nikki, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. So for me, I'm very clear with myself that the first step to dismantling imperialism is attacking the military, because militarism is one of the ways that the US exerts its power around the world. And it also is the way that it creates refugees. So I'm always getting people, as people talk about defund the police, I always say, did you know that the US military is like the biggest police department on earth? And so if you're talking about defunding the police, how about we defund the military too? You know, so like that's always like, I think it's very concrete that people can think about, like, so the US military and its role. And it's not just waging wars, but it's also environmental destruction. So for people who are thinking about climate change and people are thinking about environmental justice and climate justice, like if that is something that you're doing, the US military is like the biggest polluter on earth, right? So that would be one thing. And then another thing about I okay, I'm not sure who's watching, and I'm not who's listening, and I'm not sure where you are in terms of your political journey, but read a couple books on imperialism. And one of them is Capitalism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism. And then learn about why there is a link between abolitionists and Black radical organizers, and why they have studied Marxist Leninism and Maoism, you know, because our elders have thought really long and hard about a lot of the questions that we are facing. And even though our current dilemma may look different from theirs in some way, it has the same roots. A lot of our dilemmas, a lot of our problems that we're facing have very much the same deep roots that revolutionaries have always had to contend and try to resolve. So yeah, read a couple of books on imperialism. And then on the question on being a refugee on stolen land, I recommend everyone to check out the Land Back movement and support that. Read their manifestos and their 3 points. And then another thing I have to share, like on a very personal level, I don't identify as American anymore. I mean, I know that Asian American is a political identity and it has a very specific root. It has a very radical root, but I think it's been defanged, you know, like AAPI is a census designation, right? So it is not necessarily a political identity until we make it so, right? We can do whatever we want because that's what we do. We're organizers and we can organize. But the notion of Americanness, the more that I look into it and the more that I reflect, the more that I realize that the whole thing has been around imperialism, been around settler colonialism. So what am I doing hitching my identity onto that wagon, you know? So like that has been something that I have like thought a lot about and just come to the conclusion that that's not the wagon for me.
Girl, I think you just schooled a whole lot more people on that too, because I think for so long, often us as Americans look at us as Southeast Asians or API folks in general. I mean, I think that that's what we were taught is like, we want to hurry up and get our citizenship and become American and all of that stuff, right? But I think for me, I think when I think back about what you just said, I think about for many, many years, I actually never wanted to become a citizen, because I was like, I just hated everything that I was seeing, you know, and I've been here for 37 years, and I finally just got my citizenship last year. But when they handed me the flag and all that stuff, I'm like, well, now I can travel. That's the way I looked at it. I was like, I'm gonna go and travel the world with Sarath and just, you know, like all these things. But at any rate, I thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of us actually need to understand that it's actually just a political stance, and like just be proud of who you are in your identity. But yeah, just real quick time check at 7:22. But I really want to ask you this question because I think it's important, even to what you just said, Nikki, and then when you were talking about the media. So since Hollywood is the default, how does it affect the way that the settlement of our people is being narrated through Hollywood, through the stories, through the movies, all of those things? Can you maybe take just a quick moment to talk about that? And then before you do, so that we still have time, will you please make sure you drop drop like links for the books that you're referring, that you recommend us to talk about, et cetera, because I think it's important for all of us to get that knowledge that you have shared. I know you're going to share your information, but then also your PowerPoint, but really also the books that you recommend. I would love to be able to read some of those books too, or put it in my ear and listen to it. So the question around Hollywood, sorry.
Hollywood will not save us.
That's real. I mean, I think because people who don't identify as us and they watch those movies, they think that's like all of us, and that's really that model minority myth that we also need to dismantle.
I might be interpreting this question in a different way, but it makes me think about how like what I was saying from like my standpoint as a second generation refugee, as someone who like didn't experience the war directly, the war or even like those early years of resettlement directly, but knowing that like the folks that I love experience that, and that has like shaped the post-traumatic stress disorder, right, that I see in my community, that I see in my family, and that shapes like the silence too, right, that I grew up in terms of like not being told like a lot of the stories, that silence creates like this space for imagination. And imagination on one hand, you know, refers to that there are no limits, like right, like that I can that not knowing the experience of like war or like what our families went through, it's really like our imaginations are vulnerable to kind of what is the stories that are told about war and resettlement. And when they're told from the outside, very often like the folks who, even if when they're really well-meaning, who want to tell stories about like the US wars in Southeast Asia, they're looking at it as an object, or they're looking at like our experiences from the outside. So they'll always kind of tell the stories in a certain way. And that's why it's up to us really to tell our stories, right? But again, as a second generation refugee, having like not experienced that, and have that, you know, I'm pointing to like how vulnerable we, like our perception of that is, but also, I'm lost my train of thought, that it's up to us to tell our stories, and like that as much as we think we know what like happened in the past, we won't fully, right? And that brings us to like how important like it's that our community will never be like we can't rely just on what we imagine our community to be. It's about those like experiences that we have, like being in our community. Like that's what our community is. And that's why like kind of what I was trying to say earlier about like our presence and our like togetherness being resistance.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Yeah, so that's why, Nikki, you need to drop those links for the books because we need to listen to them and read them.
Yeah, I just want to say, the director of Parasite, Bong Joon-ho, when he got the Oscars, and he's like, this is just kind of a local award show, and I really love that. I appreciate that because everyone acts like Hollywood and the Oscars and all of these things is like the center of the universe, and it is a local award show. Hollywood is, yes, Hollywood exports a lot of things, and we have to be wary of that because it's a direct mouthpiece.
Yeah.
Empire. So it's just gonna produce shows that continues to perpetuate the myths of US exceptionalism. So why are we seeking approval from an institution like that? Like not me. It couldn't be me.
Yes. So I just want to thank everybody again for joining us today. Thank you, Sheila and Nikki, for being here. You all were both really amazing. So I just want to just send a quick reminder that we are still collecting donations for our first return here in Minnesota, first Southeast Asian deportation back to the Midwest. And the link will be posted in the chat, also in the comments. We want to, make sure that we, to illuminate the struggles of our returnees, our next show's topic, which will be on June 17th, will be on the struggles of returning from prison, detention, and deportation. So please donate. We want to be able to help them to be able to reintegrate and to protect them and their identity. It is anonymous, but all of the funds that you all will donate will go to help them to get back on their feet, and so that Minnesota Aid can continue to support them in that way. But yes, watch out for our next talk series, and it again is going to be on June 17th. And please go and support by donating to the GoFundMe page, and you can check out Minnesota Aid's work at www.releasemn8.org. Thank you all so much for being here. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.